Okay, students, this is Mr. Gotro. I see not a lot of people showing up today. Again, this is our fifth week of school. I understand we've had some problems, but you still need to come to class. So we press on. So what we're talking about today is settlement in the Chesapeake. Yesterday we did the Massachusetts colony, so today we're going to talk about the Chesapeake, which is the area around Virginia and present-day Washington, D.C. So the reasons for European migration were many. A lot of people came over here for religious freedom. A lot of people came over here because of money and to look for goods. The British Empire was expanding, so they wanted to have some sort of foundation, some sort of foothold in North America. Now, first we're going to talk about is Virginia. Virginia is near the Chesapeake Bay, and it was an English colony that started off. I'm going to go into some things about why, how it started off. English colonization. It got a charter from the a private charter, not a royal charter. Royal charter means that the king or the queen granted it. It's guaranteed to colonists the same rights as Englishmen as if they had stayed in England. So basically what the British were doing was they're spreading their power structure over to the colonies. This provision was incorporated into the future colonist documents. Colonists felt that even in the Americans, they had rights as Englishmen, and that was true because they were protected by the crown. England plants the Jamestown seedling. Late 1606, the Virginia Company sent out 3 ships. In the spring of 1607, they land at the mouth of Chesapeake Bay. They were attacked by Indians, but they moved on. On May 24th, 1607, about 100 colonists, all men, landed at Jamestown along the banks of the James River. They were easily defended, but swarming with disease-causing mosquitoes. And obviously, the Europeans didn't have immunities to a lot of these diseases that they would encounter either. There was a colony that was unsuccessful. Now, mark what I'm saying because it is going to be on a test. There was an unsuccessful colony that was started in 1585 known as Roanoke Island. And this colony started, like I said, in 1585. The ship said, okay, we'll come back a year later, see how you're doing. When they came back, everybody was gone. And on the only thing that they found was there was this tree. And on this tree, there was written Croatoan, Croatoan. And a lot of people had speculated as to what that was. Is that a Indian tribe? Is it a disease? Nobody knows. So that was the first unsuccessful colony. Jamestown was the first successful colony. Roanoke Island was unsuccessful. Excuse me. So it was easily defended because of where it was. And they have rebuilt it so that if you go there, you can practically see what it was like to live in Jamestown. They found some ruins and all this other stuff there. So it was easy to visualize. Jamestown settlement, what it basically looked like in 1609. And this is a map of the Chesapeake Bay. Was there a geographic or environmental problem? And sometimes there are storms coming off the Atlantic. You have harsh winters in Virginia because it's above the Mason-Dixon line. Places that are further away from the equator, the temperatures are colder in the winter. And were there environmental problems? Sure, there were woods where they were. And they had to get rid of those woods in order to build cities. This is basically what the Jamestown fort looked like and the settlement map. People were to the far. I'm going to point to this a little bit. Okay, you have the entrance, I believe, is right here. Okay, and you have all these settlements inside of the people that are settling the Jamestown colony, but you have these fort walls that protect you from Indians. Indians didn't like people invading their land. In fact, they didn't know what to make of the European settlers when they first came over here. So that's what we're seeing in the founding of the Jamestown colony. This is another outlook of what the fort looked like. There have been excavations, and they have found pottery. They have found belt buckles. Shoes had belts back then, by the way, belt buckles on them. And if you remember when you were in elementary school seeing photos or illustrations of pilgrims, they had buckles on their shoes. So this was a computer-generated model of what Jamestown would have looked like. The housing was mostly wood, not very well insulated. They had fireplaces, of course, to make it through the winters, and they cooked, they grew everything. They slaughtered their own animals to cook. And like I said, if you ever get to go up there, there's a Jamestown Historical Site settlement, and there's people that are actually, excuse me, dressed in period clothing from that era. So you get to actually see what people look like and how they lived back then. And here's some more pictures of what the Jamestown settlement looked like. And of course, they were very religious. They were very pious. They thanked God that they got here safely, and they looked to God to protect them from any of the other problems that they might encounter, including Indians, disease, natural disasters, and things of that nature. So this is the chapel that was built in 1681. If you note, there's a cross right there. You can see it. Okay? And so we have this established colony. How long would it last? It would last a long time. They would go through what was known as very hard, the starving times, which they had to rely on Indians to help them get through it. But they got through it, and then they got a new governor somewhere along the way. The Jamestown Nightmare, I had referred to it just a second ago. 1607, 1606 to 1607, 40 people died on the voyage getting there. Imagine yourself, somebody gets on a boat, they have a disease. There's nowhere to go on these boats for 2 or 3 months. Start spreading the disease and people die. Other people may have had immunities to it, or starvation or dehydration, whatever the case may be. In 1609, another ship from England lost its leaders and supplies in a shipwreck off Bermuda. The settlers died by the dozen. This doesn't look like it was very much of a success, does it? So when we look at Jamestown, it wasn't exactly a shining example of what a settlement should be. Gentlemen colonists would not work for themselves. They'd get other people to do it. Game in forests and fish in the river went uncaught, and they could have lived if they'd known how to do this. Settlers wasted time looking for gold instead of hunting or farming. You know, you get the necessities out the way first, and then you do what you need to do. Captain John Smith, was he the right man for the job? Jamestown needed a governor. There was no talk but dig gold, wash gold, refine gold, and load gold. And he came in and he made some distinctive changes. There was, of course, Pocahontas, and Pocahontas saves Captain John Smith. There's a 16, if you see this 1616 engraving of Pocahontas, you will see she is not as visually pleasant as she was portrayed in Disney movies. She was kind of ugly, sorry. But then again, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. She later married John Rolfe, not John Smith. John Rolfe was a tobacco farmer in Virginia near Jamestown. The English migration, if you look to this, between 1610 and 1660, a lot of people looking for religious freedom and just looking to get away from the monarchy of England. You have 25,000 went to New England, 50,000 went to the Chesapeake, and 110,000 went to the West Indies. Obviously, people were trying to get away from all that cold weather, and so that's probably why we see one of the biggest migrations to the West Indies during this time. River settlement pattern. There were large plantations, 100 acres. They were widely spread apart by 5 miles. Now, were there social and economic problems? Of course there were. Bad harvests, animals dying, disease. Of course. It was a new colony. Those things are going to pop up. Well, how do you make them better? Well, you have to work to do it. This is back-breaking work. So we have the social and economic problems. Of course, there were people, you had the gentlemen farmers who didn't want to work, so they had to bring in what was known as indentured servants. Now, an indentured servant is someone who cannot afford the passage to the New World, So they pay somebody. Well, they don't pay somebody. They sign a contract and they go to the New World and they work that contract off, generally over 7 years. These were mostly white people, Northern Europeans, white Northern Europeans. And at the end of those 7 years, well, they didn't really receive a lot of education. So basically what they did was they sold themselves back into slavery. And this is the colonization pattern between 1620 and 1660. There was just not one settlement. There were other settlements going across that peninsula. So they wanted to spread out, and that's what they did. So if you notice all these lines, here's Jamestown right here, and these are all the other settlements that are going into and basically encroaching on Indian land, Native American land. They had to cut down forests to build these things. There were high mortality rates. I talked about the starving time. In 1607, there was only 104 colonists. By spring 1608, only 38 survived. In 1609, 300 more immigrants come to Jamestown. By spring 1610, 60 survived. The rest died, so there was 240 people. 1610 to 1624, 10,000 immigrants. In 1624, the population was only 1,1200. So you're looking at a little more than 1/10 who came over between 1610 and 1624 who actually survived. The life expectancy was only 40 years. So, they didn't know a lot about medicine. They didn't know a lot about diseases. These people were not really hunting. They were just doing what they were supposed to do to barely scrape by. Death of children, high infant mortality rate before the age of 5 was 80%. So a lot of children died as well. And if we look at this picture, you can see this right here is a grave that was found when they were doing the excavations in Jamestown. It's preserved. Now, let me make a stipulation here. When I say preserved, that means not that their whole bodies were intact. They'll still have their skin. I mean that they were preserved in the time in which they were buried, so that we can tell. You can glean a lot from a grave. You can glean a lot if you go into a cemetery. I know this sounds kind of morbid, but when I was younger and my daughter was younger, when the summers when she was off and I was teaching in middle school and I had the summers off, we'd go to cemeteries and look at different tombstones, and see when people lived. And, my daughter had a very keen interest in that. We went to St. Louis Cemetery one time and took some pictures and saw Marie Laveau's tomb and Homer Plessy's tomb and how the cemetery was divided between Catholic and Protestant. It was very interesting to me and to her. They had a widowarchy, which was a high mortality rate among husbands, and fathers left many women in the Chesapeake colonies with unusual autonomy and wealth. And this was unheard of in England. Women did not have any rights whatsoever in England, much less the ability to garner any wealth. So we had what was called the widowarchy. Chief Powhatan, he was one of the Indians in the area. He developed what was known as the Powhatan Confederacy, and he dominated a few dozen small tribes in the James River area when the English arrived. The English called all Indians in the area Powhatans, even though they may have belonged to other tribes. And they did. They probably did belong to other tribes. Powhatan probably saw the English as allies in his struggles to gain control over Indian tribes in the region. He was looking for an ally, basically. The Powhatan Confederacy, if you look at this, you see right here is Jamestown all over the place. And I think the reason why the colonists did this and tried to make a living arrangement with the Indians was that they didn't want to be killed. It's basically what they wanted. They wanted an alliance with the Indians that would make them be able to live their own lives. And so, that's why these things were done. The enemy, and Powhatan saw it as the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And if I can get an alliance with the English colonists that live here, I won't have problems with the other tribes. If there's a war, I can get them to come fight it with us. This was a traditional Indian village in the area where they had like straw and mud huts. Of course, when it rains, those things kind of melt if they don't dry properly. You mix straw with it. That's a 1,000-year-old recipe, straw and mud together. And when it dries, the straw actually takes the moisture out of the mud and it becomes like cement. Indian foods, if you'll notice over here: corn, beans, squash, beans, beans, heavy diet of beans and corn and meat as well. They would hunt local animals and they would take those animals and they would slaughter them, of course, and they would cut them up and cook them, you know, to go along with their beans and their corn. But see, corn, which was known as maize back then, was the first real crop that anyone saw in the North American colonies, because it was easier to grow, easier to harvest, and it was just phenomenally good eating. By the way, Indians invented popcorn. Actually, they used to dry the kernels, and then when they put them in some sort of hot lard, it would pop and take the moisture out, and bam, you'd have popcorn. I wouldn't recommend making your own popcorn like that at home. You can just buy it in the store. It works out great. Oh, and use cotton oil too. It tastes like the movie theater popcorn. Anyway, so this is a typical Native American staples of food. There was a culture clash. Of course, there's going to be a culture clash on the Chesapeake when you have two different cultures, such as the Native Americans and the colonists. Relations between Indians and settlers grew worse. There was general mistrust because of different cultures and languages. Nobody spoke the language. The English raided Indian food supplies during the starving times. Didn't help much. And between 1610 and 1614, there was the first Anglo-Powhatan War. Excuse me. Okay, Delaware War. Let me see if I can open this up a little bit so you can read the bottom. Okay. All right, let me see. All right, there you go. So when, they were running out of food, the Native Americans, the colonists decided to raid the Indian villages to gain the food because they knew they had the food. Raided villages, burned houses, took supplies, and, burned cornfields. Smith's portrayal of the Native Americans. Now, let me tell you something about Mr. John Smith, okay? Mr. John Smith was a self-aggrandizing jackhole, okay? He wrote a book about his time as governor of the Jamestown colony and Virginia. And it was all about how he did everything great, how he treated people. When in actuality, the only law he came up with in Jamestown was that really meant anything was if you don't work, you don't eat. But he was and he portrayed the Native Americans as very subservient when actually they considered themselves, the Indians basically considered themselves equals to the white colonists. Let's see. From 1614 to 1622, there was peace between the Powhatans and the English. In 1614, peace sealed by the marriage of Pocahontas to Englishman John Rolfe. John Rolfe, like I said, was a tobacco farmer. She did not marry John Smith. That is a fallacy that they put in these particular movies. Between 1622 and 1644, there were periodic attacks between Indians and settlers. And in 1622, Indians attacked the English, killing 37, including John Rolfe. Now, what did John Rolfe do after he married Pocahontas? He brought her back to England, which was a mistake, and displayed her like a circus act. She died in England, and that's where she's buried, in England. She's not buried in America. The Virginia Company called for a perpetual war against the Native Americans, and raids reduced native population and drove them westward. So basically they succeeded in driving the Native Americans out of the Chesapeake Bay area and into the wilderness. This is an illustration of the Powhatan Uprising of 1622. Of course, the colonists, they didn't know how to deal with Native Americans. Again, they didn't speak the language. There was no communication or anything of that nature. So they just, they killed them. If we don't understand something, we hate it, we kill it. And from 1644 to 1646, there was a second Anglo-Powhatan War. In the last effort of natives to defeat the English, the Indians were defeated again. And the reason being is because the English had more modern weapons, like the flintlock musket and swords and big old knives and battle axes. There was a peace treaty in 1646, and it removed the Powhatans from their original land, formally separated Indian and English settlement areas. Now, did what Chief Powhatan do work? No, it didn't. It didn't. And the problem was that the Native Americans were distrustful, but they trusted anyway. John Rolfe, let's see, what finally made the colony prosperous was the tobacco plant. Tobacco became a large crop. In fact, they named it the wacky weed because it stunk. People smoked it, but they stunk, and it was in its natural form. But it was something that took off, so people enjoyed smoking the tobacco. Virginia's gold and silver was tobacco, and John Rolfe knew this because he was a successful tobacco farmer. Early colonial tobacco in 1688, Virginia produces 20,000 pounds of tobacco. That's 10 tons, actually. 1622, despite losing nearly one-third of its colonists in an Indian attack, Virginia produces 60,000 pounds of tobacco. So in 4 years, they tripled it from 20,000 to 60,000. In 1627, Virginia produces 500,000 pounds of tobacco. In 1629, Virginia produces 1,500,000 pounds of tobacco. Now look at this. This is just 2 years, okay? And they basically, doubled it, went from a million, it tripled it again. Tobacco prices in 1688 to 1710. Now, I'm going to teach you a little economics here. You see where it was in 1618? Okay, you see where the price of tobacco was here. Why did it go down so quickly and then go back up just a little bit and a little bit? Okay, well, because they weren't producing that much between 1618 and 1620. And then when they produced so much and injected it into the market, the price goes down because there's less demand. Supply and demand. Indentured servitude, indentured servitude, I explained that to you. Now, the headright system was a system whereby people were offered a certain amount of land that they can cultivate in exchange for them coming to the New World. There was something about, head rights was a form of measurement. And that's why they call it the headright system. And then we have this indentured contract from 1746, which is almost a century after the colonists got here, but it was still in service then. The headright system was each Virginian got 50 acres for each person whose passage they paid. The indentured contract was 5 to 7 years, promised freedom dues, land, and money. This is the symbol for pounds, which is English money. And but they were forbidden to marry, and between 1610 and 1614, only 1 in 10 outlived their indentured contracts. So you're looking at basically, certain death. I mean, if you have to outlive the contract in order for it to be worth anything. Richard Fraythorn's 1623 letter. This was one of the colonists that wrote a letter. We're not going to do that one. That's an in-class activity. All right. Tobacco. Virginia was a child of tobacco. Tobacco's effect on Virginia's economy played a vital role in putting Virginia on a firm economic footing. Ruinous to soil when continuously planted, chained Virginia's economy to a single crop. So tobacco promoted the use of the plantation system. They needed a cheap, abundant source of labor. And that's when we start to see slavery begin to grow in the New World. I think I explained it before about Christopher Columbus. When he came over, he enslaved the Native Americans and found out when they ran away, they knew where they were going. So he had to find a labor force that didn't know where they were going, and that's why African slaves became a very unique source of cheap labor. Why was 1619 a pivotal year in the Chesapeake settlement? Well, they formed the House of Burgesses, which was their governing body. And they generally went by the laws of the United States, England, when they came over. The House of Burgesses established in 1619 and began to assume the role of the House of Commons in England. They had control over the finances, militia, and etc. See, before that, all they had was one governor. Hello, Miss Williams, how are you? Miss Rose, how you doing? Having difficulty today? Okay, so by the end of the 17th century, the House of Burgesses was able to initiate legislation. So now we start to see the first form of active government here in the New World, away from England. A council was appointed by the royal governor, was mainly leading planners, functioned as the House of Lords. In England, there's a two-house parliament. And in that two-house parliament, they have the House of Lords, which are people who are from the aristocracy, and the House of Commons, which are from the common people. And they make the laws together, you see, kind of an equal voice. Here in the United States, we have the House of Representatives and the Senate. All right? Let's see, there were high death rates ensured rapid turnover of members. There was a high death rates, whether it be from an Indian attack, whether it be from some sort of disease, or something like that. James I grew hostile to Virginia. He was the King of England at the time, and Virginia was actually named after Queen Elizabeth I, who was known as the Virgin Queen. I'm not sure if that was true, but, that's what we hear. He hated tobacco. He distrusted... Oh, that's great. Everything's fine. Fantastic. I'm glad to hear it. You and I are the only ones here. He distrusted the House of Burgesses, which he called a seminary of sedition, because he believed that the king should make the laws. In 1624, he revoked the charter of the bankrupt VA company, and thus Virginia became a royal colony under the king's direct control. So that's how he shuts off the House of Burgesses, is that the colony comes under the direct control of the king because it's a royal colony, you see? Okay, English tobacco label. The first Africans arrived in Jamestown in 1619. Now, the first African slaves who arrived here in what would be called the Western Hemisphere was almost a century earlier, all right? There's a project out there called the 1619 Project that talks about, and they got their dates wrong, and they misinterpret history all over the place. And there's no historians associated with the project, believe it or not. But anyway, their status was not clear. Perhaps slaves. Oh, good. All right. Yeah, we're going to have to make some adjustments because a lot of students aren't showing up. They're not telling me why they're not showing up, so I may have to get on the phone with them. We don't have classes on Fridays, I don't think. I haven't been holding them on Fridays. I think it's just Monday and Wednesday. Slavery was not that important to until the end of the 17th century. Now, why is that? Because they brought over, well, actually, they discovered cotton. And in the South, especially Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas and Florida, there was cotton. The population in the Chesapeake grew substantially But why this large increase in black population in 1690? Like I said, I don't know if we have class on Friday. I'm looking at your answers right here. I'm not sure if we have class on Friday. All I was under the impression that we just had Monday and Wednesdays. That's it. Anyway, so why this large increase in black population? Cheap labor. They had to bring cheap labor over to work on for the tobacco. Okay, we've seen like a map like this concerning the Atlantic slave trade. I explained why there was a great shark population right here over the time frame from about 1492 until well into the 1800s because of the slave ships coming over. And this is one of the scourges of American history is slavery. I won't deny that. But I'm pretty sure that with mechanization, and we try to get into this in American history too, slavery would have died out eventually with mechanical means rather than having a civil war. But that's just my opinion, and it's another facet of American history. So as you'll see, there was gold traded. There were different things traded between these countries for slaves, and they brought them to the West Indies. Actually, more slaves went to South America than they did to North America at the time. Goods that were traded with Africa were flintlock muskets, glass beads. They like that. Ooh. What's that? Conch shells from the Indian Ocean. And you see brocades, and you see some clothing, and you see bad thing is rum and wine and brandy. You don't give that to people that don't know what it does. So this is what the goods that were normally traded with the people of Africa. This is known as the Middle Passage. And of course, we discussed the Middle Passage. And if you look at this, you'll see a model of, well, actually a drawing of a typical slave ship. From the back, you see different decks. This is the front deck. This is below deck right here. So they're packed together like sardines because it was on consignment. And if you missed the first couple of lectures, I can explain consignment. When people wanted to delve into slavery, they used to hire ships to go over there and grab or buy slaves from African chieftains who kept their prisoners of war to bring them over here for the slave market. And they would put in a certain number, and the crew would not get paid until after the slave market holder, the guy that owned the slaves, sold them. Okay, the guy that procured the slaves sold them. That's what consignment means. If you have a piece of antique furniture and you want to sell it, generally the antique owner of a shop will say, okay, I'll take it on consignment, which means that they don't get paid. If they don't get paid, you don't get paid. You see? So that's how it works. It's kind of like you got to sell it or it doesn't make any money. Colonial slavery. As the number of slaves increased, white colonists reacted to put down perceived racial threats. Slavery transformed from economic to economic and from an economic to an economic and racial institution. Slaves had to be portrayed as uneducated. They needed to be directed to do what they needed to do, shown them in repetition so they know what the job would be done, which was very little confidence by the white colonists in the intelligence of slaves. In the early 1600s, there were differences between slave and servant were very clear. Like the indentured servants that you had over here, they were servants. They were only indentured or indebted to the owner, to the person that brought them over here for a certain amount of time. Slaves, it was for life until they got emancipated. By the mid-1680s, black slaves outnumbered white indentured servants. Beginning in 1662, there were what was known as slave codes. And that made blacks and their children property or chattel for life of white masters. In some colonies, it was a crime to teach a slave to read and write. Because basically they wouldn't really know why they were in slavery if they had an education. They would educate themselves. Conversion to Christianity did not qualify the slave for freedom, but a lot of slaves had given up their what I call pagan religions or native religions, that would be pagan religions considered by Christians, actually. But it didn't guarantee them any type of freedom. And they felt comfort in religion back then as well. So that's what we see in the colonies and when you're describing colonial slavery. In the late 1600s, there were large numbers of young, poor, discontented men in the Chesapeake area. They had little access to land or women for marriage. In 1670, the Virginia Assembly disenfranchised most landless men. If you didn't own any land, you didn't have the right to vote. Nathaniel Bacon had a rebellion in 1676. This is him, and this was the governor of Virginia, Governor William Berkeley. He led 1,000 Virginians in a rebellion against Governor Berkeley. Rebels resented Berkeley's close relations with the Indians, and Berkeley monopolized the fur trade with the Indians in the area. Berkeley refused to retaliate for Indian attacks on the frontier settlements, and therefore there was a rebellion by some of the poorer colonists. This shows you a map of the battles that took place. Did it fix anything? Not necessarily. Did it show discontent? Yes, it did. But it didn't solve anything. It just showed that the colonists rebelled because they didn't agree with the powers that be that were doing what they were doing. Rebels attacked Indians during the rebellion, whether they were friendly or not to whites. Governor Berkeley was driven from Jamestown. Rebels went on a rampage of plundering. That's what revolutionists do when they don't get what they want. Sometimes it's like a crying little baby doesn't get what they want. Well, do you give a crying baby what they want? No, you don't. You wait till they calm down. They burned the Capitol. Bacon suddenly died of a fever, and Berkeley, who had recovered from being thrown out of Virginia, brutally crushed a rebellion and hanged 200 rebels. And that was the example that they made. When you have people that rebel like that tear down, the only thing they know is destruction, that is the justice that can be meted out, is that they're immediately crushed and brought down. Governor Berkeley's fault line, this line was put there so the colonists wouldn't go over it in order to settle, because then, there wouldn't be any trouble with the Indians. The result of Bacon's rebellion was it exposed resentments between inland frontiersmen and landless former servants against gentry on coastal plantations, the rich against the poor, basically. The socioeconomic class clashes between rural and urban communities would continue throughout American history, and they continue today. Upper-class planters searched for laborers less likely to rebel, African slaves. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Maryland. In the settlement of Maryland, a royal charter was granted to George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, in 1632. Well, of course, Baltimore was named after him. It was a proprietary colony that was created in 1634. It was a healthier location than Jamestown. Tobacco would be the main crop again, and his plan was to govern as an absentee proprietor in a feudal relationship. Well, feudalism was going to be eliminated. Feudalism is a form of serfdom which creates nothing but very rich and very poor people. His plan, huge tracts of land were granted to Catholic relatives. Now, if you look at it here, this is Maryland. Maryland later became a state. It was a border state during the Civil War. Kind of slavery was kind of ambiguous when it came time to the Civil War. And this is St. Mary's City in 1634. Of course, this is an artist's conception. I'm not sure if they've done any archaeological digs there, but this is what it looked like. Looks very pleasant, right? But I don't think these fences are going to hold in Indians, all right? So it looks like they left themselves open for an Indian attack. The currency in early Maryland was, and it's another thing too, each state or colony had their own currency, and this would be a problem when the American Revolution started because there was nothing uniform. So you really didn't know what exactly you were spending. And values, they valued differently. It was a haven for Catholics. Colonists only willing to come to Maryland if they received land. Colonists who did come received modest farms dispersed around the Chesapeake area. Catholic land barons surrounded by mostly Protestant small farmers. Conflict between barons and farmers led to Baltimore losing proprietary rights at the end of the 17th century, which means that there were conflicts, and of course probably they set on their own government, and they said, look, we don't need you anymore. All you're doing is making money and you're exploiting everybody. In the late 1600s, black slaves began to be imported to Maryland. Okay. Lord Baltimore permitted a high degree of freedom of worship in order to prevent repeat persecution of Catholics by Protestants. There was a high number of Protestants threatened because of overwhelming rights given to Catholics. And then we have the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649. It was supported by Catholics in Maryland, and it guaranteed toleration to all Christians. It decreed death to those who denied the divinity of Jesus. That was kind of harsh, like Jews, atheists, etc. In one way, it was less tolerant than before the law was passed. Because, you know, if your religion is, well, I don't believe in Jesus Christ, well, then why should you suffer death if they passed this act that made it more tolerant? This is the Toleration Act of 1649. It's passed by some sort of assembly. And it goes on, you can read it at your leisure. It talks about religious toleration and what won't be tolerated. And it's not really a toleration act if it tells you what won't be tolerated. And so here we see finally by 1660 all these British settlements that had gone forth. And what we notice is how they branched out just a little bit, but they didn't go past Baltimore's that demarcation line that was first set forth in that. So anyway, so that concludes today's lecture. It will be up on YouTube. I'll send the link after it's rendered. It's got to be processed by YouTube. And you guys have a great weekend. I'm probably going to put up a quiz based upon these lectures, 10-question quiz, and it'll be taken through Moodle, so you don't have to send it back to me. It'll automatically be recorded, okay? So I will see you guys Monday. Don't forget to check your emails, check Moodle to find out if there's anything further up there, okay? So have a great weekend.